There are less than 2 months until week 1 of the NFL season. Now, whether you're trying to figure out who to take in fantasy or you want to know what to expect, you're in the right place. So, in no specific order, these are essentially the top 10 running backs that should have the most production this season and should be going at the top of your fantasy drafts, and why they are. First, Christian McCaffrey is back as one of the premier guys to watch in the NFL. Before last season, he had only played in 10 games over the last 2 years because of injuries. He was a beast for a few seasons in Carolina, especially in 2019 when he had 1,387 yards and 15 touchdowns. He also caught 116 passes for 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns. He really did do it all. McCaffrey was a first-team All-Pro for the first and actually still the only time of his career. Now, he was good in Carolina, but his time had to come to an end eventually. The Panthers decided to trade him to the 49ers last year for a second, third, fourth, and fifth. McCaffrey ended up spending 6 total games in Carolina last year and then 11 games in San Francisco. In all, he had 1,139 yards and 8 touchdowns, plus 85 receptions for 741 yards and 5 touchdowns. He is so back, and he's on a stacked roster with George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk, so it's really safe to assume that McCaffrey is going to dominate again this season. Now, despite never having over 1,000 rushing or receiving yards in a single season, Austin Ekeler has still solidified himself as a top running back in the league. Last year, he ran for 915 yards and 13 touchdowns. He also caught 107 passes for 722 yards and 5 touchdowns. 2021 was very similar, and he's recently started to develop his running game. In his 6 seasons in the league, he's only missed 9 total games. Now, looking towards this year, the Chargers offensive line, it's pretty mid, but with the return of Rashawn Slater, who was a second-team All-Pro at one point, it does have the ability to turn around after he suffered a season-ending injury in Week 3 last season. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Ekeler has his best receiving season yet with his new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, calling the plays. Last year, Moore helped Tony Pollard make his first Pro Bowl while working with the Dallas Cowboys. Pollard ended up running for 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns. He also had 39 receptions for 371 yards and 3 touchdowns. Now, despite a good season, he was still having to share reps with Ezekiel Elliott. But now that Elliott is gone, Pollard is ready to break out as the true starter. In the 2 games Zeke missed last year, Pollard ran for a combined 246 yards and 4 touchdowns. He is surrounded by a good line and Dak Prescott, who did just lead the league in interceptions, even though he only missed 5 games. Now, in his 4 seasons overall, Pollard has only missed 4 games. So for him, injuries don't seem to be a problem, but at running back, you never know. I do think it's safe to say, though, that he is going to be a focal point on the Cowboys offense this year. Staying in the NFC East, Saquon Barkley is back, and oh my goodness, he's good again. He struggled with injuries in the past, and he even missed 21 games in the span of 3 seasons, but last year he thrived. The only game he missed was in Week 18 to get extra rest before the playoffs. He finished with 1,312 rushing yards and 10 touchdowns with 57 receptions for 338 yards. Saquon was named to his first Pro Bowl since his rookie year back in 2018. Now, he hasn't had the best offensive line, but they're young and they should improve. The New York Giants even brought in some new weapons like Darren Waller, Jalen Hyatt, and Paris Campbell. It might seem like the new additions could take away some of the spotlight from Saquon, but honestly, it should help distract opposing defenses and really just create more opportunities for him in the passing game. Most likely, the number 1 pick in your fantasy draft last year was Jonathan Taylor. However, he went on to have a pretty disappointing season. The 24-year-old played in only 11 games and ran for 861 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's not great in the passing game, and he finished with only 28 receptions for 143 yards, but we've seen what he is at his peak. In 2021, he led the NFL with 1,800 rushing yards and 18 touchdowns. He had his best receiving season with 360 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was named a first-team All-Pro. Now, the Colts passing game now is looking pretty lackluster with Gardner Minshew as their starter. I do think it's safe to say that the Colts are going to primarily focus on the running game next year, but it is hard to know exactly what the offense looks like because the Colts did just hire the Eagles offensive coordinator, Shane Steichen, to be their new head coach. Taylor's good, but unfortunately the pieces around him are pretty bad. Now, the only rookie actually on this list, and I love Jahmyr Gibbs, but we have to talk about Bijan Robinson. This year, the Atlanta Falcons took Bijan with the 9th pick, which made him the highest drafted running back in 5 years. Bijan was a beast at Texas last year. He ran for 1,580 yards and 18 touchdowns. He also caught 19 passes for 314 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, Bijan will technically have to compete for the starting job with Tyler Algier and Cordarrelle Patterson, but I fully expect him to be the starter, and he's just another one of those young guys on the Falcons. Bijan is the 3rd Falcons position player drafted in the top 10 in the last 3 years. The other 2 were Drake London and Kyle Pitts, 2 very bright stars in the receiving corps. Now, they also have Desmond Ridder, who they turned to at the end of last season. He's 23, and he is going to finally get his shot at quarterback this season. So we'll see how that plays out. Luckily for Atlanta, they play in the worst division in the league, so it's likely that the Falcons are actually in playoff contention, and Bijan may be leading the game plan. Now, the Las Vegas Raiders recently franchise tagged Josh Jacobs despite his desire to leave, and now he may hold out, but let's say he does stays. Now, the Raiders weren't very good last season, and it was a gigantic mess with Josh McDaniels in year 1, but Jacobs did have a very good season. He led the league with 1,653 rushing yards and also had 12 touchdowns. He even contributed to the passing game with 53 receptions for 400 yards. He ended up being named a first-team All-Pro. Now, Devontae Adams is clearly the best player on that team and is the leader of the offense, but with a pretty average quarterback, there's not much he was able to do. This offseason, they've made some pretty big moves and have maybe gotten worse. They did trade Darren Waller to the Giants, and their big addition was Jimmy Garoppolo, who's just an injury-prone Derek Carr, and who knows if he actually ends up playing with his whole foot issue. It's very likely the Raiders are even going to be worse this season, but Jacobs does have the opportunity to still be the bell cow in Las Vegas. Now, Derrick Henry is the definition of a freak. This past year, he had his 3rd best season in the league, and he had 1,538 yards and 13 touchdowns. He did end up with his best receiving season with 33 receptions for 398 yards. Now, in his career, he's led the league in rushing yards and touchdowns twice. In 2020, he became just the 8th player in NFL history to run for over 2,000 yards in a season. The Titans have 3 options at quarterback, and that's going to be what to watch here. They will likely use Ryan Tannehill until Malik Willis or Will Levis are ready to take the next step. The big concern with Henry is his age. He's only 29, but running backs are notorious for having their careers plummet after like 27. Henry has started to show a little bit of signs of slowing down, but he hasn't exactly fallen off a cliff. Now, probably the most actually talented running back in the league is Nick Chubb. He's not only a great running back, but he also has a really good situation. Last year, he ran for over 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns. He also had 27 receptions for 239 yards and a touchdown. Now, the Cleveland Browns have done a really good job building a strong line for him to run behind, but their passing game was pretty lacking. Deshaun Watson did only play in 6 games because of that suspension, but maybe with his first full season back, he can maybe look like his old self. With Kareem Hunt leaving, Chubb should be the sole focus in the Browns running game. Chubb has been one of the more consistent backs in the league over the past 5 years. Over that time, he's had over 3,600 yards and 48 touchdowns. This year, he'll probably make his 5th consecutive Pro Bowl and continue to solidify himself as the best player at his position. Easily the least known guy on this list is kind of a wild card, and that's Rhamondre Stevenson. I think he's going to be that guy that probably breaks out this year. Last season, he was good. He had over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns, and he played a pretty solid role in the passing game with 69 receptions for 421 yards and a touchdown. He was solid last year, but now with Damian Harris going to the Bills, Stevenson will be the clear-cut starter. Bill Belichick's team team always performs better than they should on paper. Talent-wise, this offense is maybe a 5-win team, but as long as Belichick is the coach and has that defense, they're probably going to win 8 or 9 games. Personally, I think Stevenson could legitimately be the star of the Pats offense for the next couple of seasons. Now, injuries do happen, so running backs end up being a really difficult group to actually predict their future. But as it stands right now, these guys are the ones that should have the best seasons this year, at least on paper.